Hello and welcome to The Nation. I am PASHA, RAHIM. The dust has settled in Cebu following the conclusion of the 48th ASEAN Summit. Now, amid rising geopolitical friction and also a volatile conflict in West Asia, regional leaders have emerged with direct instructions. Accelerate energy cooperation, fast-track the ratification of the ASEAN Petroleum Security Agreement, or the APSA 2.0, and move closer toward a regional fuel stockpile. To unpack the post-summit realities, the economic ripple effects, and also what this means for Kuala Lumpur's strategic interests, we're joined live in the studio today by a distinguished voice in regional diplomacy and corporate strategy. He's the president of the KSI Strategic Institute for Asia Pacific and also the chairman of the ASEAN Economic Club, Tan Sri Michael YEOH. Thank you for joining us, Tan Sri.
Thank you, Basha. Glad to be here.
Amazing. Now, Tan Sri, how did the Cebu Summit achieve any real strategic breakthroughs, or do you think it was just business as usual?
Well, the ASEAN Summit always has got its regular procedural processes where they would look at the reports of the ministers, the economic ministers, the foreign ministers. So in that part, it is very much also business as usual. But I would say that the fact that the ASEAN Summit took place this year in Cebu in person is an achievement by itself in the light of the geopolitical situation, the conflicts in Middle East and Iran. For the leaders to come together in person, I think, signifies renewed commitment to ASEAN, that the ASEAN leaders are all committed to ensuring the success of ASEAN. There were a few interesting takeaways from this summit in Cebu. I would think one of the important things was adopting the Cebu Protocol that amended the ASEAN Charter to formally admit Timor-Leste as a member, the 11th member of ASEAN. The other achievement, I think, is having the Maritime Cooperation Declaration adopted at the summit that would lead to the establishment of a ASEAN Maritime Center in Philippines is another interesting point. And I would say also the Leaders Summit on the Middle East crisis is an important achievement because the Leaders Summit on the Middle East crisis has named the US and Israel for their bomb and their attacks on Iran, and I think that's a significant point to take note of.
Right. Tan Sri, with the Philippines now taking a firmer stance, how can Malaysia balance the South China Sea maritime friction, at the same time without breaking that ASEAN unity?
I think the South China Sea is a very, very important issue for ASEAN. It is something that has been dragged on for a long time, the negotiation and the conclusion of the Code of Conduct for the South China Sea. Malaysia was hopeful that we would be able to conclude the Code of Conduct at the summit last November in KL, but unfortunately we were not able to get a full consensus to get that moving. I think the Philippines will face some challenges also. Sometimes China don't see Philippines as sufficiently aligned to their interests, and there might be some complications in concluding that. But I think Malaysia can play a very important role in pushing the process forward. I think we've got the confidence of China, and I think we've also got the confidence of the other ASEAN member states. So perhaps we can play a significant role in trying to push through the conclusion of this Code of Conduct.
Right. Tan Sri, let's talk about the West Asia conflict. How severe is the threat to ASEAN, and did the summit offer a truly unified response?
I think the summit did have a unified response, but the important thing is that we need to realize that the conflict in Iran and the Middle East will have a very major impact on global oil supply. And many of us in ASEAN relies a lot on imported oil from Iran.
Yeah.
So that will affect our oil supply, it will affect our supply chain, and there is also onflowing impact on increasing cost of doing business, the increased cost of oil supply. So these are issues that needs to be looked into, and these are issues that have to be tackled.
Right. Tan Sri, talking about high impact and also increasing costs, we've looked if we look back in history, global conflicts have often driven up our local food and also energy costs. Now, is ASEAN's very strict neutrality, is it becoming a liability now?
No, I don't think so. I think neutrality is one of the most important success factors for ASEAN. And I think ASEAN must stick very strictly to the principle of neutrality, because with neutrality we are able to work with all the different powers in the world. And I think our Prime Minister, Dr. Sri Anwar Ibrahim, is one of the most respected leaders in ASEAN, and I think his leadership in ASEAN, he is now probably the most senior leader in ASEAN. His leadership in ASEAN will be able to help ensure that ASEAN would focus on centrality and neutrality as well.
Yeah, I mean, I have to agree with you, Tan Sri. I think neutrality is one of our strongest points as ASEAN. Now, moving to your role as ASEAN Economic Club Chairman, how can your club help to fast-track a regional emergency response to protect our industries from global shocks?
I think very importantly, ASEAN must work hard to achieve economic security, as well as economic security and food security. I think these are important challenges that we need to ensure, and with energy, food and health security, ASEAN can become more resilient. And I think this calls for stronger partnership between the public and private sector, so cooperation between business and governments will be very essential. And that's what our role is in the ASEAN Economic Club, to foster stronger cooperation between the public and private sectors.
Perhaps you could share with us what are some of the activities that you have undertaken as of today?
Well, we try to organize dialogues between governments and business communities, the business sector. We also provide a platform for the NGOs and civil society to provide their inputs on their areas of concern. And we also have meetings and dialogues with the ASEAN Secretariat in Jakarta as well.
Right. Let's talk about what some of the regional tools that we can leverage on right now, right? And so if we look at fertilizer and energy costs, now these are both soaring. What do you think are some of the things that we can leverage on to stabilize domestic prices?
The increase in price is somewhat inevitable with the increase in the oil price. So we need to be able to ensure that there are mechanisms where SMEs and the business community are able to absorb and cope with the increased costs of doing business. Here in Malaysia, the government has come up with the subsidies and the targeted price for fuel, but we also need to recognize that subsidies is costly.
Yeah.
And we have to assess whether the country can keep providing such a large amount of subsidies that can impact on other areas of the economy. So striking a very fair balance is something that's important. I think what's also important is to get the business community to move further forward in increasing their efficiency, their productivity, because increased efficiency and productivity will help reduce costs, and it will also make things easier for the private sector. At the same time, the government must focus more on deregulation. I think liberalization, deregulation will be very necessary to ensure that decisions are made quicker so that business can move forward in a faster manner.
Right. Now, leaders have also discussed a regional fuel stockpile. Now, in your view, Tan Sri, is sharing strategic fuel reserves, now, is this a realistic way to go, or is it something that's a little bit too idealistic for ASEAN?
I think it's a good proposal. This proposal came from our meeting minister, Dr. Sri Johari, at the last summit last week. And having a regional oil stockpile, I think, would be very beneficial for the region. I think we can build up our oil reserves and work on a mechanism where we can share the stockpile oil to countries that need it more urgently. So I think working collectively to build the oil stockpile for ASEAN, I think is a very important goal to achieve.
Right. Leaders have also issued a direct instruction to fast-track the ASEAN Petroleum Security Agreement, or the APSA 2.0, and also the ASEAN Power Grid. Why has regional energy cooperation been so slow in the past, and why are we only rushing to do all of this now?
Well, the energy crisis requires us to quickly improve the speed of implementation of the ASEAN Power Grid, as well as to scale up ASEAN energy transition. One of the difficulties in getting the power grid approved is sometimes national interests take precedence over the regional interests.
Right.
I think there was an occasion when Sarawak tries to sell oil. Try to have the underground cable connecting hydropower from Sarawak through Johor to Singapore and on to Indonesia. And we had some objections from the Indonesian government on that. So in some instances, there are national issues that have taken precedence. And what is important now is for ASEAN to think regionally and to put the region ahead. We perhaps must put ASEAN first.
Right. Well, apart from that, what do you think are some of the other challenges, that we have within the region that would prevent or rather slow down having this regional energy cooperation?
I think the cost of stockpile is very high. The cost of energy transition is also quite high. So there is a need to ensure that there is sufficient financing for energy transition to be successfully implemented. There is also a need to get the private sector to be on board to also support the energy transition process.
Right. Tan Sri, this is something that's very interesting for us to talk about, the China Plus One investments. Now, just looking at us, Malaysia as a country, what do you think are some of the critical economic reforms that we must champion so that we can remain the top choice?
I think the important thing is to ensure that business is treated as a partner with government. Business must feel that they are able to generate profits, that they can make money, and that the government facilitate them in that process. So in this regard, I would say that fast-tracking the approval processes from various government agencies would be very essential. Further liberalization of rules, making entry easy for foreign investors. I think we have now liberalized visas for people coming in from China and India. That will help, and I think we need to do a bit more in being able to ensure that the process of getting government approvals is smooth and facilitates the effective implementation of investments.
What do you think makes Malaysia a top choice in your view?
I think we have several major advantages. First, those who comes from the English-speaking countries, for example, would recognize our rule of law, that we have a common law system with UK and many of the other countries. They respect and recognize that. I think the other important thing is that our living environment is very conducive. Foreigners feel very at home living in Malaysia, and they find the standard of English spoken as excellent. We have very good infrastructure and connectivity throughout the region and with other countries as well. So I think all of these are very positive factors that make Malaysia attractive.
Right. Tan Sri, you mentioned earlier that it's important for businesses to be able to make decisions very quickly, right? So what is one of the top concerns, or what are the top concerns for the ASEAN business community right now? Are they more concerned with security guarantees or deeper deregulation?
I think security is one issue that's important, particularly from the aspect of fighting crime and being able to operate without any coercion from criminal gangs and all that. But I think what's also more important is ensuring that regulatory approvals are obtained quickly and that there are no bottlenecks. Sometimes there is a long waiting time to get projects approved. So all of this must be simplified and expedited.
Okay, Tan Sri, I want to talk about the ASEAN Digital Economy Framework Agreement. Now, the timeline is moving quite fast. Now, how is the AEC ensuring that Malaysian SMEs are not left behind in this digital pivot?
The DEFA, the Digital Economic Framework Agreement, was supposed to have been ratified last November when Malaysia chaired ASEAN. It wasn't. We hope it can be done in the Philippines by October. There is a need to ensure that SMEs are not left out in the digital transformation. I think things that needs to be looked at will be capacity building, providing training for SMEs, ensuring that they have the necessary skills to adopt digital technology, particularly AI. So AI training will be very important, very essential. We should perhaps also start teaching coding in schools so that our younger generation will be equipped with sufficient knowledge in digital technology and ensuring also cybersecurity. The new cyber security strategy for ASEAN for the period 2026-2030 has been agreed upon, so we need to move forward with that as well.
Right, Tan Sri, if you're just looking at the SMEs, because that's our focus right now, are we in a good position to be able to adopt a fully digital economy, or do we still have challenges?
I think we are in a good position to fast track digital transformation. The SMEs here are very much involved now in e-commerce. So with the growth of e-commerce, they can scale up digital transformation very quickly. They have to also invest a lot more in technology, and they need to be able to have skilled workers that can operate various digital mechanisms.
Yeah, but obviously with the ASEAN Digital Economy Framework, we're not just focusing on Malaysia. We're also looking at the region as a whole. How do we ensure that the other countries who are not up to par yet, that they don't get left behind? Is that something that we can do?
I think all of ASEAN will be upgrading themselves. I think everybody is excited with DEFA, and they want to prepare their people and especially the SMEs for the transition to DEFA. And I think this is an important challenge that ASEAN has to adopt, the scaling up of digital transformation. I think one important thing is that for some of the less developed countries in ASEAN, they have to invest more in digital infrastructure. I've always emphasized the importance of digital inclusion, that the rural outlying areas have sufficient telecoms coverage, and that the people there are not left out of the digital economy.
Right. And it is very important for ASEAN to move forward as one, because unity is one of our strongholds as well. Tan Sri, the Prime Minister, Datuk Sri Anwar Ibrahim, has been very vocal about ASEAN centrality. Now, how did Malaysia's specific interests, how do we fare in Cebu?
I think ASEAN centrality is a very important goal for ASEAN, and something that we have to uphold all the time. Prime Minister Dr. Sri Anwar has always been focused on ASEAN centrality, and this was one of his key focus areas when Malaysia chaired ASEAN last year. I would say that the 4 key challenges for ASEAN are what we call the 4 Cs. That is, of course, ASEAN centrality, the ASEAN Charter, ASEAN connectivity, and ASEAN community. And I think in terms of the centrality trust for ASEAN, I believe that Malaysia, and in particular Prime Minister Dr. Sri Anwar, can be an important bridge builder with many other regions, many other countries, because he's a respected leader. And we can also help push the acceleration of the RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, because with the fast track of RCEP implementation and adoption, it will put ASEAN very much in the center. So ASEAN centrality can be further enhanced with a faster movement for the RCEP.
Let's talk about, again, the role of the AEC. How does the AEC plan to bridge the gap between high-level diplomatic, rhetoric and talks in Cebu, and how does that relate to the wallets of just ordinary, everyday Malaysians?
I think the important thing is to get ordinary people be more aware about the potential, the opportunities of ASEAN, and get the business community to also see that there is a lot of opportunities in working together and in exploring the opportunities in the different ASEAN countries. Our intra-ASEAN trade is not very high. I mean, the trade between, say, Malaysia and Cambodia and Vietnam is not very high. Some of these countries trade a lot more with countries outside of ASEAN.
Right.
So the important point is now, through the strengthening of ASEAN centrality and ASEAN connectivity, we are hoping that the intra-ASEAN trade can be further improved and enhanced.
Right, so we really should be looking at our neighbors moving forward, right?
Yes.
Let's talk a little bit about the power grid, right? So how do you think Malaysia should push for a smaller coalition of willing neighbors, since we're talking about cooperation with our neighboring countries? When we're talking about projects like the power grid, instead of having to wait for absolute consensus from everyone.
Perhaps we can look at sub-regional power grid. In the case of Malaysia, it can be Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia, Brunei, Philippines, can be examples of that. I think in the northern regions, we've seen Laos, Vietnam, Thailand cooperating together. So that's something that can be looked at. One of the major challenges that ASEAN face is the whole definition of ASEAN consensus. Because with the consensus focus, we need the agreement of all 10 countries. And sometimes when we don't achieve that, ASEAN works on the lowest common denominators, that they settle on the easiest things to agree on. In that regard, we are not pushing further, we are not making further progress. So perhaps we have to look at the redefinition. Perhaps maybe 8 or 9 ASEAN countries agree to do something can be regarded as a form of consensus rather than waiting for all the 10 countries to agree on a point. While we want everybody to move forward at the same time, sometimes we do have to, take matters into our own hands and do what we can first. Tan Sri, what is the current outcome in Cebu? Is it a strong enough, or has it laid a strong enough foundation for the ASEAN Vision 2045? Or, are we still looking at little crises within our countries? Well, I think there are issues that ASEAN have to firefight. The firefighting in ASEAN will continue for a while more. But more importantly, I think we have to look at the big picture. Yeah, because I think ASEAN has so much potential. If we can focus on the big picture, I think a lot more can be achieved. I think what's necessary is for ASEAN to punch above its weight. We are a big region. We would be the 4th biggest economy in the world collectively by 2030, and hence we can be a major power by itself. So let's focus on that, and let's move forward to provide the impetus for future growth of ASEAN.
Definitely. The future is so bright for ASEAN, and we can be a regional powerhouse if we all put all of our heads and our hearts and our minds to it. Tan Sri, thank you once again for all of your very valuable insights. And as the ASEAN navigates a more uncertain and divided global landscape, the challenge moving forward, it won't be just about maintaining regional unity, but also ensuring that cooperation delivers real economic security and also opportunities for the people in this region. We were talking to Tan Sri Michael YEOH, Chairman of the ASEAN Economic Club. I'm PASHA RAHIM. Thanks for watching The Nation. We'll see you again soon.